Great. We have a very full night tonight, so I'm not going to waste any more time. My name is Grace. I'm Code Pink's engagement manager. You see my face every single week right now, and I'm so grateful for you guys to keep trucking along with us. If it's your first time, you are in for such a treat. Tonight is going to be amazing. But once again, thank you all so much for joining another week of our anti-imperialist campaign action series. These weeks are designed to go deeper with each of our Code Pink campaigns, learn more about the people behind the movements and how all of our liberation work is connected to Palestine, to Venezuela, to Cuba, to peace with China, and to peace with the planet. If you've missed any of our webinars, calling parties, or didn't grab some of our resources, feel free to sign up with our archive resource link, which I will send in the chat in just a bit, where you'll receive absolutely everything from our past action weeks, and you will receive all of our upcoming alerts for our Latin America action weeks. I'm going to go over the norms super quickly, and then I'm going to pass it to Michelle to get us started. But as always, please be respectful. This isn't a debate, but a discussion. We are not here to mediate arguments. We're here to learn from each other. Be kind, be curious, be ready to take action. And above all, please, please, please stay muted. We record and live stream these classes for future radio shows, other webinars, other resources. So we want people for years and years and years to come to enjoy this content tonight because it's going to be just so, so amazing. So I'm going to pass it over to Michelle to get us started.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you all for joining us tonight as part of this Latin America Week of Action. I am Michelle. I'm a Venezuelan American and part of the Latin America campaign team for Code Pink. And before we begin today's discussion, I just wanted to take a moment to share what this campaign is about and why it matters so deeply right now. What we're seeing today in Latin America and the Caribbean, the drone strikes, sanctions, mass deportations, that didn't start yesterday, right? This is a continuation of centuries of US intervention, justified by the old same idea that Latin America is somehow the US's backyard. And at Code Pink, we are organizing to finally break with that logic to demand a good neighbor policy of the 21st century, one that is grounded on respect, on sovereignty, and non-intervention. Our work is to inspire, to educate, to activate people in the US to see our neighbors as partners in building a hemisphere of peace and dignity. So when I first joined Code Pink, I think that legacy felt impossible to ignore. The US regime was threatening and eventually did seize the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. And instead of staying silent, Medea and many people who are here just did something extraordinary, which was to put their bodies on the line to defend international law and the right for the people's self-determination. And inside that embassy, I think I met the bravest and most principled people that I've ever known. And that experience basically changed how I see or how I understand the word solidarity. Because US intervention in Latin America has many faces. It looks like sanctions, economic warfare. It looks like ICE raids and deportation flights. It looks like centuries of resources flowing north while poverty, instability, and debt are flowing south. But resistance also has many faces. It looks like Venezuelan people organizing under a blockade. It looks like Cuban doctors bringing healthcare around the world. It looks like Nicaraguan communities defending solidarity. Our region is full of life, courage, and creativity. And that's what our campaign at Code Pink is about. We have our website, codepink.org/Latin America, where you will find things like country spotlights to uncover the truth behind US aggression. We have a rapid response team for Venezuela, ready to mobilize when escalation occurs, toolkits, petitions to fight sanctions and war, and creative projects also like Pen Pals for Peace, which is an initiative to connect children in the US with children in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua via letters and drawings and stories. Every action that we take, whether it's a delegation to Cuba, a petition, a protest, is part of a larger mission that is to inspire people to question empire, educate them about its impact, and activate them to build a better hemisphere. Because we know that this is not really like a Republican versus Democrat issue. This is a systematic issue. It's a bipartisan empire that has justified its control under the same false promise of freedom. So tonight, webinar is basically to explore that history, how the Monroe Doctrine became the ideological foundation for intervention in Latin America, and how its legacy continues to define the relationship or the relations between the US and Latin America. We're honored to have with us Steve Ellner, Vivien Lesnik Weisman, Jill Clark-Gollub, three incredible speakers. But for now, it's my honor to pass it to my incredible co-host, Medea Benjamin, someone that I'm lucky enough to call both my friend and my mentor, and who has inspired so many of us through decades of fearless work, reminding the world that peace and sovereignty must always come before war and profit and power. Take it
So
up.
nice to be with you, and so nice to be following up on the remarks that you just made. Because Michelle, thinking back of the days when we met you at the Venezuelan embassy, so much has gone on since then. And I'm glad you brought up that U.S. policy towards Latin America is pretty much the same whether Democrats or Republicans are in power. I must say there have been some good things sometimes when a Democrat is in power, like when Obama was there and opened up relationships with Cuba, which was then closed by the Bush administration, not reopened under Biden, and now, of course, under Trump, all kinds of attacks. But the subtlety of the Democrats is really trying to mask the continued idea that the Latin America and the Caribbean are the U.S. backyard and the U.S. should control it. We're going to hear more tonight about the history of the Monroe Doctrine, but I do want to say that it was under the first Trump administration when John Bolton was the head of the National Security Council. He has since been indicted by the Trump administration, but when he was on good terms, he said that the Monroe Doctrine was alive and well. And Trump did talk openly about Latin America being in the U.S. backyard. And the effort has been to try to keep China out, although China is very much a major part of Latin America's trade, and U.S. efforts have been very unsuccessful in that realm. But we hear continued efforts by the Trump administration, and especially with Marco Rubio. You know, some of us thought that this administration would be so wrapped up in the Middle East that they wouldn't have time to interfere in Latin America. But having Marco Rubio there as Secretary of State and so many of the right-wing Cubans and Venezuelans in Congress, they have been extremely busy, as we're going to hear about tonight. And just to give you a little taste of what happens when we go into Congress, while Grace talked about how we try to integrate the issues in Code Pink between what's happening in places like Palestine with U.S. interference in Latin America, the U.S. Congress is doing the exact opposite, linking these by showing how the enemies of the United States in both places. For example, tomorrow there is a hearing called Hezbollah's Latin America Drug Trafficking and How It Finances Terrorism. So they are linking the issues in a way to justify U.S. intervention. We link the issues in a way to inspire U.S. solidarity. And in that vein, I'm very happy to welcome our first speaker, Steve Ellner, who is a retired professor at the University University, Universidad de Oriente in Venezuela, where he lived for over 40 years, and he's currently an associate managing editor of the journal Latin American Perspectives. He's been a visiting professor at Georgetown University, Duke, University of Buenos Aires, Australian National University, and Tulane, and he's also taught at Columbia University and Johns Hopkins. In 2018, he spoke in dozens of cities in the U.S. and Canada as part of a Venezuela Solidarity tour, and his article with Trump, Polarization Among Venezuelans Reaches New Heights, was posted today in NACLA's report on the Americas. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Steve.
Well, thank you, Medea, very much. Webinars like these are educational, as somebody mentioned, but also inspirational, because just being in a group like this and hearing different interventions serve as an inspiration for many of us. In order to understand the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued in 1823, being a historian, I'm big on this, it's necessary to understand the context of the Monroe Doctrine, understand what was happening in 1823. In fact, that allows us to understand the really perverse underlying argument of the Monroe Doctrine and its perverse use over the succeeding 2 centuries. But actually, I'd like to go back to begin with to 1776, because the Independence War, at the No Kings rally on Saturday in Washington, which I heard Bernie Sanders speak, and I'm sure in other cities across the country, there was a lot of talk of the dual aspects of the independence, Declaration of Independence. On the one hand, the assertion of national sovereignty, democracy, as it was known then. But also the other aspect was the slavocracy, in which majority of the people enjoyed no democratic representation at all: women, indigenous people, African Americans. So fast forward to 1823, the US by 1823 was considered somewhat of a beacon of democracy vis-a-vis Europe, which by then reaction had set in. Reaction against the French Revolution, which for sure was much more democratic and much more far-reaching than the Revolution of the United States. But in 1814, the Congress of Vienna represented the final defeat of the French Revolution, and the Holy Alliance emerged based on the absolute right of kings, specifically Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburgs of Austria, and also in France and Spain. So the possibility that Europe as a whole, and specifically Spain, would attempt to retake Latin America. By then, the colonies of Latin America, Venezuela, and the rest of South America, Mexico, had pretty much won the wars of independence. But this possibility was really what motivated, in many ways, the issuance of the Monroe Doctrine. So on the one hand, there was this positive aspect that the United States was saying that any attempt to reassert control over the ex-colonies would be considered a hostile act by the United States. Actually, the United States lacked the naval power and the army capability to do anything if Europe had decided to intervene. But the fact of the matter is that Metternich, who was the architect of the Congress of Vienna and the reaction that had set in, he was angered by the Monroe Doctrine. But on the other hand, the Monroe Doctrine stated that the United States will allow Spain to continue its control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and other colonies. So the United States wouldn't do anything about that. But more important than that, the United States, Monroe specifically, was saying, or said in the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States would not meddle in European affairs. That is to say that there were 2 separate spheres. The European sphere, and that was up to Europe. That was Europe's business. The United States would stay out of Europe, but Europe had to stay out of the New World because that was US territory. So that was the basic premise of the Monroe Doctrine. And for the next 2 centuries, I think we can talk about really 2 different stages here. One was the period after the Monroe Doctrine, up until the US Civil War. in which manifest destiny was based on the idea that U.S. expansionism was inevitable. So that you had Southerners and filibusters, people known as filibusters, who were really working to expand the system of slavery. And the reason for that expansion, the reason for the activity of those filibusters, Narcisco Lopez, who incidentally was Venezuelan born, but he got Southern money in order to try to liberate Cuba on 3 occasions, William Walker in the case of Baja California and Nicaragua, etc. Those efforts were based on the idea that slavery had to expand, that it was an imperative. And the reason why I insist on this term imperative, that it was imperative for slavery to expand, it was either do or die. Because in a second stage of the Monroe Doctrine, which was the 20th century and up until the present, you have another imperative, and that's the imperative of imperialism. And Lenin is famous for his work on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, in which he states that it's not a question of any given policy. It's not that somebody in power wants to, have the United States expand or derive additional benefits. It's an imperative. It's not a policy. And that essentially was refuting the works of Kautsky, who thought that it was a policy of financial capitalism. In other words, there were options. You had financial capitalists, you had other capitalists who might be the good guys. And in addition, he said that eventually you would have ultra-imperialism, which meant that the monopolies would get together, and so you wouldn't have any imperialism at all because everything would be planned, just like under socialism. You'd have planning, and there wouldn't be any need for war, which, according to Lenin, imperialism inevitably led to war. That war was inevitable, just like imperialism was. So the important point to make here, and I'm trying to keep track of time so I don't go over the 10-minute limit. Let me know when I get close to that. The point that I want to make here is that if imperialism is inevitable, that means that the application of the basic precepts of the Monroe Doctrine, that the Latin America is the sphere of U.S. influence, just like the Europeans had their sphere, the United States had its sphere in the Americas. And if that's the case, if it's not a question of a policy of a given leader, but rather an imperative of the system, then the conclusion is that both political parties, going back to the early 20th century, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that both, by then you had a 2-party system basically, they're both going to be the parties of imperialism. And the Monroe Doctrine is going to be used to justify U.S. intervention in both cases. And I think that one example of that at the outset of the 20th century was the case of Woodrow Wilson. A lot of people consider Wilson to be an enlightened figure. His slogan, "Make the world safe for democracy." At first, he wanted the United States to stay out of World War I. And then when he went into World War I, it was for that purpose. But yet, and when he came to power, he stated that he would be different from Theodore Roosevelt, whose slogan was "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Taft, whose slogan was, imperialism to make money for financial capitalism. He was opposed to that at the level of rhetoric. But you look at the countries where the United States intervened shortly after he reached power in 1912. I mean, in the case of Mexico in 1914, he sent the Navy to seize Veracruz, Mexico. 170 soldiers were killed simply because a U.S. admiral wanted to force Mexicans to salute the U.S. flag. Nicaragua, in which the U.S. intervened shortly after that, in order to get Nicaragua to promise not to declare war, not to contract debts, and other important decisions could not be made without U.S. authorization. That's under Wilson's influence. He sent troops into Haiti in 1915, fearing that an anti-US politician would take power. And then the case of sending troops into Mexico to hunt down Pancho Villa, that also occurred under Woodrow Wilson's Clark. So that that is a good example. Now we can fast forward, and for the sake of time, I'll do just that. I'll forward to 2013, when John Kerry, the Secretary of State of the Democratic government of Obama, Medina made reference to Obama, and I agree that he did some good things, but Kerry stated that, okay, the Monroe Doctrine is no longer applicable. But why? Because the United States is not going to intervene unilaterally. It's going to intervene through the consent of its allies. And so that became the basic precept of the Democratic Party, and has been ever since, multilateral intervention. And it's used that every time it can. For instance, in the case of Venezuela that Michelle made reference to, the group, the Lima group. So at the time, there was a right-wing pushback in Latin America. The United States could rely on different countries' right-wing governments in order to justify its policy against Venezuela, sanctions against Venezuela. But in other cases, in the case of Gaza, for instance, the whole world has been opposed to Israel's policy in Gaza. It came up in the United Nations Security Council, and all the countries, even our allies in Europe, were in favor of a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Only the United States, it stood alone in opposing that resolution. And in the case of sanctions against Cuba, every year in the United Nations, there is a resolution condemning US sanctions against Cuba, and yet the United States stands alone with Israel to vote against that resolution. So that the Democrats and the Republicans stand together on this. They stand together on it because, as Lenin said, imperialism is not a choice. It's not an option. It's an intrinsic part of the capitalist system in the age of imperialism. And I just wanted to end with this. And that is, politically, when you look around and especially now, in a lot of these, I go to these No Kings protests in Rockville, near where I live, on Saturdays. And I'm kind of really, firstly, I'm pleasantly surprised by the number of people who show up on a weekly, every Saturday, with a lot of spirits and a lot of good slogans and everything. But I'm also amazed at the fact that foreign policy is out of the question completely. I'm really amazed at the fact that there's so many different slogans, but all those slogans deal with domestic issues. And I think that is the difference between the left in the United States and liberals, in the good sense of the word, of liberals. The liberals are good on domestic issues, but they stay away from foreign policy. And I think that has a lot to do with the close relationship between liberalism and the Democratic Party. Those liberals, have one foot in the Democratic Party. They're loyal to the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party is unwilling to break with imperialism. It's unwilling to assume, good positions on foreign policy. And specifically in the case of Latin America, look, you have the situation with Venezuela. Some Congress people are speaking out with legalistic terms that what Trump is doing in the Caribbean is illegal. Some are saying that Congress has to debate the issue, but they don't go further than that. They don't talk about the possibility of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela and what that implies. So that this demonstrates once again that there's a fundamental divide between those who defend the position of intervention throughout the world, and specifically in the case of Latin America, on the basis of the precepts of the Monroe Doctrine, and those who want to break with those policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. He's my dad. Thank you, Steve. I'm very proud of you. Thank you for that powerful, insightful presentation, and for giving us the historical context that we need to understand how we got here. You reminded us that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have the same imperial agenda, and that the Monroe Doctrine has never been partisan. Please mute. And then, and that is like the guiding principle framework for domination in our region for centuries. So now I want to introduce our amazing Vivien Weisman. It is my honor to have her here. She was born in Havana, Cuba. She graduated from Barnard College with a BA in art history and political science, and New York Law School with a doctorate in jurisprudence. She was then accepted to be the New York Bar and the Washington, D.C. Bar Association. Vivien went on to receive an MFA in directing from UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. Her first feature film was The Man of Two Havanas, about her Cuban revolutionary father, premiered in the Tribeca Film Festival, and went on to win the most prestigious awards throughout the world, including the Grand Prix documentary and the Festival International du Cinéma Latin de Paris, the IFP, Pledging Fund Award for the Best WIP Emerging Latino Filmmaker, the Audience Award at the Vancouver International Latino Film Festival, the first Choral Award at the Havana International Film Festival, the Grand Prix signé at the Festival International du Cinéma Latin de Paris. Vivien is also interested in the intersection of spiritual evolution and social justice. She resides in Santa Monica, California, and serves at the Code Pink Board of Directors.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that was so long. So
Impressive.
I was invited because my father was a revolutionary. He went to the University of Havana with Fidel Castro. They were friends, comrades. They forged a revolution together. But I wanted to comment that the United States has always had its eye on Cuba. It tried to purchase Cuba from Spain in 1854. So we have the Monroe Doctrine, we have the ripe fruit and the manifest destiny, but we also have this correlation between the slave owners in the United States, the white supremacy of the United States, and wanting to prevent another Haiti in Cuba next to the United States. So it really, there's many speakers and thinkers that talk about they want to prevent the Africanization of Cuba with its Afro population. So they wanted to purchase Cuba. $120 million were offered to Spain for an outright purchase, and Spain refused. But there were a lot of war noises because they really wanted Cuba to be part of sphere of influence. Then the professor spoke of the filibusters, and there was also a attempt to annex Cuba, to make it a state. So they've always wanted Cuba. So now we go on, and I'll get to 1959, which is what everyone wants to hear about. So interestingly, some people don't know that the Cuban Revolution was not a socialist revolution. It was an anti-imperial revolution. What the young idealists at the University of Havana, my father was in law school, and so was Fidel Castro. But their rallying cry was Cuba si Yankee no. And my father added, well, my father was supposedly coined that. He claims that he actually did not. But that was part of the demonstrations at the University of Havana. And the University of Havana was an autonomous zone. So you could go foment, trouble in Havana, and then you could run to the university and the police could not storm the university. So both my father and Fidel infinitely postponed their exams at the law school so they could take advantage of this autonomous zone that protected them from the law, from the police, from the military. So the University of Havana had professors that were also revolutionaries, because this has been done Cuba has been fighting one revolution after another in order to stay free from the United States. So when they would cancel their exams. So both my father and Fidel Castro were members of something called the Orthodox Party that has nothing to do with Jewish Orthodoxism. It was a bourgeois reformist party. There was a man named Eduardo Chivas who was running for president. He committed suicide before the election. But in the elections that were later canceled because Batista performed his coup d'etat, Fidel Castro was running as a senator for Havana. So he was not anti-capitalist revolutionary at the University of Havana. But then you have the coup d'etat. So when you have the coup d'etat, all these young revolutionaries continue to foment revolution. My father as a journalist, and eventually Fidel Castro goes to Mexico, where he, disembarks at in the mountains with his grandma, with his boat. So my father went to the second front, which was called El Escambray. But going back to the University of Havana, none of them were members of the Communist Party, which was a legal party, which was called the PCP, because the Communist Party had not yet denounced, until later with Khrushchev, had not denounced Stalin. So you would never have these young idealist revolutionaries want to be members of the Communist Party. So they were all finding their way. My father's best friend, Alfredo Guevara, who was also a revolutionary, who participated in the attempted coup called the Bogotazo in Colombia. He was an anarchist, but none of them were Marxists. So they all read about Marxism, they read about revolution, they read about the Chinese Revolution, they were all enamored and they loved the glamour behind it, but none of them were members of the party. So what happened, what they were was vehemently anti-imperialist and vehemently anti-American. Okay, so because the United States, since the Monroe Doctrine and later through the Platt Amendment said that the United States had the right to intervene militarily on Cuba whenever it liked. And even though the Platt Amendment was repealed in 1934, they still kept Guantanamo Bay, which was part of the Platt Amendment. So they kept Guantanamo Bay, but they repealed the Platt Amendment, but that did not change anything because the United States dominated political, social life in Cuba and economic life. So it was the economic domination of the United States and the large American corporations over Cuba. This is what the Cuban Revolution was fought for, in order to get sovereignty, economic independence from the United States, and sovereignty and dignity. So it was not an anti-capitalist revolution. Of course, that comes much later. So, well, not that much later, but later. So when these young idealists want independence, economic independence, at this time, Cuba was very advanced because it had a railway system that was built at the same time that the robber barons built the railways in the United States. They built it in Cuba. They had a telegraph system before Spain. They had the railroads, United Fruit. They had ways of gathering agriculture, which was on par with the United States. So what happened was you had this very advanced economic vassal of the United States, but you had color TV everywhere, not color TV, TV sets before you had them in small towns in America. So when finally, when the revolution, how am I doing on time? I'm sorry. I'm okay. Okay. So then when Castro comes to power, my father was in the second front, and he was one of the first people because when the United States takes away well, it's so interesting. When the United States stopped supporting Batista, that's the downfall of Batista. So in January 1st, 1959, Batista leaves. So when Batista leaves, that's when the revolutionaries start coming down the mountains, because that's it. Now there's a political void in Havana. My father's in the second front, which is 4 hours away from Havana. So he goes, what he was doing was running propaganda from the Second Front and from the rebel enclave. So he comes down and he starts announcing and going to the press like the revolutionaries were already in Havana, even though they were making their way. There was an 8-day vacuum. So my father had a third position when my father he left, even though this was the revolution he had fought for, because he believed in a non-aligned Cuba. The other corollary to that was seeing Washington ni Moscow, without Washington or Moscow. So this later, Fidel took this on to become the head of the non-aligned movement. But at this time, my father later amended his position because he realized that it was impossible to keep to not have the revolution be toppled unless they align themselves with one of the two superpowers. So we know that Fidel, Che Guevara, we know they all went to speak at the UN, and Castro was there in order to receive support from the United States, just like all the other presidents of Cuba needed economic support. He did not go making war noises, even though he was very confident in his backing of the Cuban people and of the revolution. It's not to imply that he didn't want an independent Cuba. But what happened is that he was rebuffed. And so it was very clear. And Nixon, we know that Nixon said that he might be a Marxist. And so what happened? So now the Soviet oil, the cheap Soviet oil, comes to Cuba. And Standard Oil, owned by the United States, well, it's an American corporation, refuses to refine the oil. So now this is when Fidel Castro and the revolution start aligning themselves. It becomes obvious that they are not going to be able to survive unless they align themselves with another power. So so I think it's interesting that this is about the Monroe Doctrine and about imperialism, and that the Cuban Revolution really didn't start as a socialist revolution, but rather as an anti-imperialist, anti-US domination, pro-sovereignty situation. And now nothing has changed, because in all these years, first we had the invasion of Cuba through the Bay of Pigs. It's not called the Bay of Pigs. We call it, the Cubans call it the Bay of Pigs. Well, the invasion of Cuba. Okay, El Límite. Okay, thank you, Michelle. So basically, we're now with the blockade, the embargo against Cuba. It's really Monroe Doctrine. It's really trying to, well, there's more than that. You have a socialist revolution right next to the United States. And it really is part of it's still the sphere of influence of the United States, like the Monroe Doctrine. So to have an example of a socialist revolution in a poor nation next to the United States, when we always hear about the healthcare and all the advances of the revolution, is extremely threatening to the system of the United States. It's so much so that they have tried to strangle it economically, and after they stopped invading it, economically tried to strangle, and they continue to try to strangle and make the revolution fail. And Cuba has not failed. It's poor and it's struggling, but there it is. And I guess I didn't get to the Man of Two Havanas in Miami, but maybe you'll invite me back.
Thank you so much, Vivien, for a fascinating look through the history of Cuba, and oftentimes through your dear father's eyes, whom so many of us who knew him loved him dearly and appreciate all the work that he did in his lifetime for the Cuban people. Our next speaker is Jill Clark-Gollub. She's from a U.S. Nicaraguan family and visits Nicaragua regularly. She sits on the coordinating committee of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network, and she is the coordinator of Americas Without Sanctions, a project of the Sanctions Kill campaign. She has organized courses and delegations to Nicaragua and has published in various alternative media outlets. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Jill.
Thank you very much, Medea. And I'm going to share my screen. Shoot. Okay. Yes. Okay. And let me show this. There we go. In slideshow. And I hope everyone can see. In full screen. Okay, so I have a little bit of geography and a lot of history to go over with you, and then I'm going to talk about the psychological impacts of this history. And in the mid-19th century, Nicaragua caught the eye of the US imperialists as a primary transit route for the California gold rush. You can see traveling from the East Coast through Nicaragua was a faster route than going by land across the United States or even through Panama. And there was an eye for an interoceanic canal starting then. You can see my cursor down here at the border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica. The mouth of the San Juan River would come from the Caribbean. Ships would go up the river across Lake Nicaragua to the town of Rivas here. And then it was a short stagecoach ride to the Pacific coast and travel up to California. So that was done by Cornelius Vanderbilt's company in the 1850s. Then we had a lot of 19th century interference in Nicaragua, including a filibuster who we heard mentioned, who did reimpose slavery in Nicaragua, made English the official language, and also burned down the beautiful colonial city of Granada. In 1909, the U.S. did their first regime change operation in Nicaragua, deposing a nationalist president, Jose Santos Zelaya. And here are his sins. I'd like to just point out he refused to honor U.S. orders not to seek re-election, but his biggest sin was that he was courting Japanese and German investors to build a canal. So from 1910 to 1933, there was almost continuous U.S. marine occupation of Nicaragua, which was virtually a U.S. protectorate. And the U.S. had majority control over the railroads, banks, customs houses. The U.S. ambassador supervised elections, and the national government was obliged to take on debt with U.S. banks. In 1912, there was a rebellion against the puppet government, and Rebel General Benjamin Zeledón, we can see his picture here. He told the Marine commander, "I will let it fall upon you the eternal burden of having used your weapons against the weak who have been struggling to conquer the sacred rights of the homeland." After Zeledón was killed by the U.S. Marines, his body was paraded through the streets of Nicaragua. Among those who saw it was a teenager named Augusto Calderón Sandino. After this, Nicaragua was forced to sign another treaty, kind of like the Platt Amendment. The Chamorro-Bryan Treaty granted the U.S. exclusive rights to build any canal in Nicaragua without any compensation for Nicaragua. Then in 1926, there was another uprising against the puppet government and U.S. occupation. And in 1927, General Augusto Sandino refused to capitulate, and with his crazy little army, launched a guerrilla war against the U.S. occupation of Nicaragua. The Marines followed Sandino into the Segovias Mountains with a counterinsurgency campaign and the first aerial bombings in the Americas. They leveled the countryside and forcibly displaced peasants from small towns, intentionally bombing civilians, burning villages and farms, and killing all the animals. Even though the Marines had some 12,000 well-equipped men to Sandino's 300 to 3,000 fighters that had only machetes and 19th century rifles, they were never able to catch or stop Sandino. Sandino became a symbol of resistance to the U.S. empire. His writings reflected class consciousness as he argued that a successful anti-imperialist struggle would need to be led by workers and peasants. He also spoke with pride of the indigenous blood that ran in his veins, and in support of Bolivar's dream to unite all of Latin America. The Marines finally withdrew, and Sandino signed a peace agreement. He called for a national movement of worker-owned cooperatives, starting with the cooperatives set up by his disarmed troops in Wiwili. But this was not to be, since the National Guard, installed by the Marines before their departure, assassinated Sandino on February 21st, 1934, on the orders of the U.S. ambassador. The Guard then went on a rampage, killing all of Sandino's supporters. Then we had the Somoza dynasty. The head of the National Guard, Anastasio Somoza, and his sons would rule the country with an iron fist for decades after that, accumulating great personal wealth in the process. The National Guard served as Somoza's private army and police, enforcing his rule through violence, torture, and corruption, always in close alliance with the U.S. government. President Franklin Roosevelt said that Somoza is an SOB, but he's our SOB. In 1961, inspired by both the Cuban Revolution and Sandino's struggle for national sovereignty, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN, was founded. As the FSLN grew, the dictatorship became more repressive, routinely using torture, forced disappearances, and summary executions against suspected Sandinista guerrillas or supporters. By the 1970s, the National Guard was killing thousands of peasant non-combatants. In 1978 and 1979, the Guard bombed residential neighborhoods in various cities indiscriminately. In the war against Somoza, 50,000 Nicaraguans were killed out of a population of just 2.8 million. Then finally, on July 19, 1979, the Sandinista People's Revolution triumphed. The revolutionary government inherited a country whose treasury had been looted by the Somozas and whose infrastructure was destroyed by bombing, war, and neglect. The revolution's priorities were education, healthcare, housing, land reform, and development for the second poorest country in the hemisphere. An atmosphere of euphoria and hope reigned. A national literacy crusade, with the help of the Cubans, reduced illiteracy from over 50% to 12%. Vaccination campaigns reduced illness and death among children, and a grassroots democracy thrived despite devastating poverty. But U.S. interference quickly slowed the progress of the revolution. The Reagan administration organized, trained, and funded counter-revolutionary armies comprised primarily of Somoza's former National Guardsmen in Honduras and Costa Rica to terrorize the population. Their acts of violence and sabotage targeted health workers, clinics, schools, teachers, peasant cooperatives, and local Sandinista officials in the northern and southern countryside. They also bombed and sabotaged key infrastructure such as seaports, the airport, roads, power lines, and generators and food supplies. The Nicaraguan government responded by organizing citizens' militias, seeking defense assistance from the Soviet Union and Cuba, and suing the United States at the International Court of Justice. In 1986, the ICJ ordered the U.S. to pay some $17 billion to Nicaragua for monetary damages, but no payment has ever been made. Throughout the 1980s, the U.S. continued its aggression against Nicaragua with the Contra War and economic sanctions, even facilitating the sale of crack cocaine in Black neighborhoods of Los Angeles to raise funds for the Contras. The CIA produced and distributed a manual called Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare that described the need to hire professional criminals for selective jobs, including sabotage and murder, and even killing their own supporters with strategically located cameramen to ensure images that would enhance public relations, and also encouraging locals to carry out acts of sabotage. By 1990, the administration had spent nearly $1 billion to overthrow the Sandinista government by funding the Contras, murdering 30 to 50,000 citizens, while many more were displaced and over 1,200 remained by landmines left in the country. And the U.S. made clear that the Contra attacks and its economic war would not end until Nicaragua elected a U.S.-supported candidate. So the Nicaraguan people did just that in February of 1990. And that ushered in the 1990 to 2007 period of neoliberal governments, which was a period of privation, government neglect, and corruption. And here are some images of what housing looked like in this period. And by 1996, 34% of the population was considered illiterate, while other human development indices plummeted. People were left to their own devices, even after the devastation of Hurricane Mitch. In 2007, the FSLN once again came into office, and it began a new stage of the Sandinista revolution and an 11-year period of peace in which the revolution was able to deliver on the promises that had been frustrated by the Contra War. This was a time of more prosperity for more Nicaraguans than at any time in the country's history, and it was a time of peace. While still the second poorest country in the hemisphere, Nicaragua was one of the first to meet nearly all of the Millennium Challenge goals by the target year of 2015, eradicating extreme poverty, hunger, and malnutrition, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality, reducing child and maternal mortality, and reducing inequality. It was a period of construction of better roads, schools, hospitals, water, and sanitation facilities. But the peace was shattered in April of 2018 when protests over modest pension reform were used to launch a coup attempt. Violent demonstrators accused the police of repression while they themselves burned down offices, bringing services to the poor majority benefiting from government social programs. Dangerous roadblocks were set up around the country at which peaceful protesters not only practiced extortion on the population, they also raped, tortured, and killed, even burning some alive, particularly those who had any connections to the Sandinista movement. Student leaders, journalists, even municipal workers. They posted ghastly images of their victims on social media to further terrorize the population. The CIA's terror manual was put back into place. Today, the country is back on the path to prosperity, but U.S. disinformation and economic warfare continue to hinder development and the fight against poverty. I hope we have time in the discussion to talk about why Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are targeted in the 21st century. But I'd like to conclude with a brief mention of the intergenerational trauma caused by this history. Since the turn of the 20th century, every generation of Nicaraguans has been impacted by U.S.-inflicted violence, starting with Sandino and others who witnessed the lifeless body of Benjamin Celedon. I have had the honor of spending time with peasant women in the Segovias Mountains of northern Nicaragua. They told me that their grandmothers had to learn to hide from the U.S. Marines lest they be raped or worse. The women of my generation learned from their mothers to hide from Somoza's National Guard so they would not be raped, tortured, and killed. As young girls, these women witnessed deserting National Guardsmen dressed as Sandinistas in July of 1979, who murdered all the men in their village. And in the coup attempt of 2018, the headquarters of this peasant women's movement in Esteli were adjacent to a violent roadblock put up by the coup forces, which further traumatized them. When I met them in January of 2019, they broke down crying, telling us about the violence that they experienced in 2018. We were the first visitors they'd had since then because so many friends outside Nicaragua had abandoned them, believing their country had become a dangerous place. In 2021, when the government jailed several people involved in the coup who had violated the amnesty conditions, I checked with these peasant women to see what they thought about it, and they said, "Thank God they can't do that to us again." As I say my last words, I'm going to scroll through some images of the Nicaraguan people I want to leave you with. While the people of Nicaragua are resolute about defending their sovereignty and peace from U.S. aggression, they are very clear that the people of the U.S. are not the same as the government of the U.S. They are counting on us to stop our government from inflicting more harm to them through false narratives, sanctions, regime change, and war. We must not disappoint them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was really powerful. And I think that we have seen in this hour the unfortunate thread throughout the history of the US and Latin America of supporting dictatorships. Yes, they might be SOBs, but they're our SOBs, not just in Nicaragua, but throughout the region. We have seen the continuity of the resistance to those SOBs and US empire and how much people suffered in trying to overthrow those governments. And we've also seen where they have been successful, like in 3 cases that we've talked about tonight of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, how the US has done everything it can to foment division, if not outright intervention like coup in Nicaragua, but also through sanctions. The threat of a good example has certainly been a threat that the US has tried to destroy in one way or another. And we are facing that in a terrible way today. And I think as we move now towards our actions, let's recognize that we are in a very dangerous moment right now with the US Trump administration's sights set on regime change in Venezuela, thinking that if it were able to do that, it would be easy to then turn to Cuba and to Nicaragua and overthrow those governments, all while the eyes of the rest of the world are focused elsewhere, like on the Middle East. So we need to be resolute. As you said, Jill, we need to be focused on what the U.S. continues to do in Latin America to try to stop people's movements from improving the lives of people throughout the continent. So for that, we will move into action with our wonderful Latin America coordinator, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Oh my God, that was incredible. Thank you to all of you and for all of you that joined today. And if something is clear about this conversation is that we need another foreign policy. We need to change it now. We cannot live under that shadow of that Monroe Doctrine. And that's why Code Pink has launched the Good Neighbor Policy Campaign, which is a movement to end that old mindset of control and then build relations rooted on respect, on peace, and mutual care. So Grace is sharing her screen so you can see our and share the link also so you can please go and sign this. When we say that we are taking action, because this is not just your name that is going to be here. It's not just a pledge. It's not just adding your name. It's you're joining like an organizing hub that really takes action. For example, we have called the Nobel Committee for giving out the so-called Peace Prize to Maria Corina Machado, someone who has openly supported coups and sanctions and foreign intervention. And we are saying loud and clear that peace prize belongs to the people of Gaza, not for those who are calling for bombs and blockades. We're also reaching out to Bad Bunny to drop Global X, the company that is profiting from ICE deportation flights. We're also calling on Google CEO to reverse the decision of renaming the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And beyond that, we are building a network of real solidarity, connecting people across borders to lift sanctions, protect sovereignty, and push back against the US war machine in this hemisphere. And this is what the real good neighbor policy looks like. It's people powered, it's internationalist, and it's rooted in justice. So please go to the link and sign the Good Neighbor Policy Pledge. And before we close, I just wanted to say thank you so much again. And we have 2 weeks packed of actions, and this is how it's going to look like. Today, where we're diving on the history of the Monroe Doctrine. Next week on our next webinar, we're going to go to the present time, the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. We'll have amazing guests as well. We have tomorrow we will have a screening of a film that exposes the root causes of migration. We'll have articles, radio shows, creative actions, and cultural events. We have the pen pals for peace that I talked to you before. And also a Latin America dance workshop. Please join us and be ready with your bottle of water and comfortable clothes. And then on Halloween, we have a street action. Every day is a day to learn. It's a chance to connect and to take action together across borders. So thank you so much. See you on the streets and see you online as we build this good neighbor policy together.